class. Today we are fortunate to have with us Mark Sestak, who's from the Department of Public Health. And Mark, please tell us about your responsibilities in your job.
I'm the director of our retail food safety program. I work with the county health departments and with the industry to enforce and apply the regulations of the State Board of Health when it comes to food safety.
Well, Mark, we really appreciate you speaking to our class today and being willing to be a guest lecturer for us. I have a couple of questions for you. And the first one is, what type of food facilities or establishments does the health department inspect here in Alabama?
The health department is given statutory authority to inspect retail food establishments, which would be what we would consider restaurants. That also includes grocery stores, the delis and the bakeries in the grocery stores, seafood markets, schools, daycare, kitchens. We also have the statutory authority to regulate food manufacturers. Those would be facilities that actually produce food that is for further retail sale, like a wholesaler. Golden Flake in Birmingham would be a good example of that. They actually make the chips and package them and then sell them to other retail outlets for sale. They would be considered a food manufacturer that we would regulate. We also have what we call the milk and dairy program, where we inspect dairy farms, milk producers, the trucks that haul the milk from the farms to the producers, and ice cream plants. We also have a shellfish program in our Mobile office where we regulate the harvest of, in Alabama, it would be oysters from Mobile Bay.
Do you have an idea of how many places you go and how many people you employ, how often you inspect?
Yeah, our largest category would be the restaurants, and we have approximately 25,000 in Alabama, somewhere in that neighborhood that we inspect on a regular basis. Those inspections are actually done through the county health departments. It's a statewide regulation that all the counties use, but we actually have environmentalists that are based in each county health department that actually administer that program. And we probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of, and the environmentalists may have additional duties. In some of the larger counties, they will be specialized and just do food inspections, but in most of the rural counties, they have other duties as well. So we're looking at total personnel, probably around 160. If we're looking at what we consider full-time equivalents, that drops considerably down to about 68. Now, the inspection frequency is a graduated scale, so it depends on score on how often those establishments would get inspected. The establishments score 95 and above would only be inspected on a 6-month rotation. Between 85 and 95, it would be a 4-month rotation. And then it drops off from there. As the score drops, the frequency increases. If somebody was to score between a 70 and an 85, that would be a 60-day rotation. And then between 60 and 70, we're going to have somebody back in there in 48 hours. And then anything below a 60 is an immediate closure. Now within that, we have certain items that they look for that we consider critical items. Those are items that we want corrected more quickly than we can wait for somebody to come back and check. Many times those items can be corrected while the inspector is in the establishment. And an example of that may be that food is out of temperature on the hot bar. Well, they can remove that food from the hot bar and it would be corrected. Some things can be corrected on site if it's a maintenance issue, so they will issue what we consider a 10-day notice on that. So even if the establishment scored a 90, if they had a critical item, the inspector would come back and check that critical item within 10 days. What
does the health department look for when they inspect a facility?
Well, it's a pretty comprehensive inspection. We have a 44-item, what you might call a checklist that looks at, and we have that divided into categories. We'll be looking at food that comes from a safe source. We'll be looking at employee hygiene. And then we'll be looking at how the food is actually processed in the establishment. This would include cooling, cooking temperatures, those sort of things. We look at equipment. That's food contact equipment and non-food contact equipment. Food contact equipment would be like, the actual spatulas, the actual pots and pans that are used. Non-food might be a countertop or something like that. It might not normally come in contact with food. We'll look at plumbing, because that's an important issue when it comes to backflow prevention. We don't want any wastewater backing up into the establishment or into the fixtures that might contaminate the food. We look at solid waste disposal. We look at used grease disposal. We look at the pest control program, and we look at how toxic items such as cleaners and pesticides are stored and used in the establishment. So it's a pretty comprehensive checklist.
Give me an example of some of the top, what you referred to as critical items, because I know when we look at a food inspection sheet, some of those carry more weight than others. I mentioned in my classes before, you can walk across a sticky floor, it'll hold your shoes, and that won't count off as much as, say, an employee eating near the food.
Well, that's exactly correct. If you look at the inspection report, there's some items that are in red, and then there are other items that are in black ink. The red items are the critical items, and they are weighted 4 or 5 points. The non-critical items will be 1 or 2 points. And that is based on risk. In the example you gave, there's a higher likelihood that there will be some type of contamination transmitted to either the food or the utensils that the employee is using by that hand-to-mouth action. So they can contaminate their hands by putting it to their mouth, and then their hands would contaminate the food or the utensils. Just walking across the floor with the bottoms of their shoes would not transmit that same contamination.
So how are restaurants scored, and what does the score mean? I know you touched on that earlier, but elaborate on the scoring process.
It is a 100-point scale, so every place starts out with a 100, and then the points are deducted from there. So it is a 100-point scale. Generally, we consider anything 85 and above to be satisfactory. And even the critical items, I didn't mention this a while ago, even if they're corrected on site while the inspector's there, the points still are debited, so the score does not change. And when they go back in 10 days to check maybe that 1 or 2 critical items, the score still will not change until that frequency that I explained comes around again. So typically, in most folks don't want, they'll say, I'm not eating anywhere less than a 95. Well, actually that's kind of difficult to do because the sheet is so comprehensive. So we're looking at overall active managerial control. How does management, how are they controlling things? Do they have a handle on what's going on in the establishment? Do they understand, what the issues are and that sort of thing? So that's some of the things we're looking at.
You touched on this about how often food facilities are inspected. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Well, I will mention that there may be different frequencies depending on the types of food. Our largest group, as I mentioned, was the restaurants, but we have other programs that may be inspected a little bit different. The establishments that's in the milk program may be inspected differently. Samples are pulled in that program. We pull samples in the seafood program, so those inspection frequencies may change a little bit. And the same with the food manufacturers. We're currently going through a rule adoption that will change the inspection frequency on the food manufacturers. If the end product is what we consider a non-potentially hazardous product, means it doesn't have to be refrigerated, then those will only get inspected twice a year, and the ones that produce a potentially hazardous product would be inspected 4 times a year.
Well, how often would you inspect a dairy?
Dairy farms, they're inspected every other month, I believe. And then there are samples that and then we routinely pull samples on those. So, and we do, if for instance we pulled a sample on their milk and it was above certain limits, and I can't quote those limits right now, they wouldn't be able to ship to the manufacturing plant until they get that corrected and a new sample is pulled that's within the limits.
Well, this is perhaps a question that reflects my ignorance, but let's follow the course of an egg. Would you inspect the chicken house? Would you inspect where the eggs came in for cleaning and ranking by size, or would you inspect it on delivery? I don't know.
Well, that's a good question, and I didn't speak to this a while ago, but there is some division of inspection responsibilities within Alabama and in all states. So actually the laying house where the chickens are at and the eggs are produced is inspected by the Department of Agriculture. Now once it reaches a retail establishment, then it comes under our regulations for the retail establishment. Or if it came into a manufacturing plant to be used in another product, we would pick it up there. So they get it on the farm, we get it once it comes to the establishment.
Okay. I've worked in for a large company before where we actually went and collected meat samples from one of the local beef producers. Mm-hmm. And there was a USDA person on site to see the animal prior to kill an after kill, and then after the patties came down, the conveyor belt. So where would you guys come in?
Meat and poultry is another one of those items that we pick that up once it reaches the retail level. So in the plants there, it's either going to be USDA, which is the United States Department of Agriculture, or Alabama Department of Agriculture, depending on where they're shipping the product and what the final end use is. So they will inspect those plants, but then once it reaches a retail establishment, then we would inspect it. And there's a little bit of overlap in the grocery stores between public health and the Department of Agriculture, and we work very closely with our partners at the Department of Agriculture. They're looking for slightly different things in say, a grocery store. We're looking at more of the sanitation issues. They're going to go in and they're going to look at things like the beef, the fat content in ground beef. If you say it's 85% beef and 15% fat, they're actually going to test that to see if that is true, if you're grinding in-house. They're going to look at the weights and measures, the scales, so to make sure you're not getting, if you buy a pound of something, it really is a pound of something. So there's a little bit of overlap in those particular establishments, so it's a joint effort.
Well, it makes me feel good we have so many people looking at our food. Would you say it's a safe assessment that we have perhaps the safest food in the world?
Well, I may be a little bit biased on that point, but I think we probably do. There are a lot of countries that are really putting forth a lot of effort to produce safe food, and the European Union is probably another one. But I think we have the safest food supply in the world. And some of that is, I base on some of the numbers that CDC tracks. That's the Centers for Disease Control. They track the number of foodborne outbreaks and the occurrence of certain organisms that cause foodborne illness. So many of those over the last few years have dropped off. So there are some that have increased, Salmonella being one of them, so that's a hard one to fight. But the others have decreased in frequency, so I say we're doing a good job with that. I mentioned oysters earlier. That's a good example to use. We monitor the bay waters, and there's only certain areas where oysters can be harvested because we want to make sure that area is free of bacteria and pollution and that sort of thing. Well, if somebody harvests oysters from outside one of those approved areas that may be contaminated and goes to a restaurant, then there could be there's hepatitis A is associated with oysters. Some of the Vibrio organisms are associated with oysters, so that could lead to a foodborne illness. Improper cooking temperatures. There's some science behind the food code, and there's some reasons those cook temperatures are in there. So we know we can kill certain organisms at certain temperatures. If that doesn't happen in the establishment, then if that organism was present or that food product got contaminated somehow by a sick worker, say, and it doesn't reach that critical control point, then that could cause an outbreak. Contaminated equipment is another one. If you cross-contaminate, say, a cutting board where you've cut up some raw meats, perhaps chicken, and then you come back and you chop up the lettuce for the salad on the same cutting board without washing it, then you potentially have transmitted disease-causing organisms to the lettuce. There won't be any further control on that. That'll go directly to the consumer. So that's some of the things that lead to that, that we would be looking for. And that's when I mentioned active managerial control, those are the risk factors that we're seeing if management is controlling, if they've got a system in place to make sure those things are done and done correctly.
Can you explain a little bit about HACCP? I know the acronym is for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points, and it was established by NASA to make sure that the food given to the astronauts in space was safe, because that's one place you can't make a mistake. You've got to make sure that the food is safe. But I understand that a lot of that is making its way into the food code, or at least the idea behind HACCP. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and actually I think Pillsbury developed that in the 60s for NASA and for the space program. And then at some point after that, the Department of Agriculture adopted that for meat processing plants. I don't remember the exact year, maybe, but so it's been in the meat processing plants. We're starting to see it more at what we call the retail level. When I keep saying retail, that's the point where the food is actually sold to or served to the consumer. That's the retail level. So we have certain things that we require HACCP plans for in the establishment. We know that more complex operations, there's more points for things to go wrong, so we require that for some things. But basically, HACCP is just a system that identifies the hazards that may occur during the food production process and puts controls into place to prevent those hazards. And by hazards, we're talking about either chemical hazards, physical hazards, or bacterial hazards mostly. It could be viruses too, but microbial hazards. And that's mostly what we're concerned with in the retail, is controlling those biological hazards, the bacteria. So what would we do if, and let's use a real classic example of E. coli in hamburger meat. So you know when you get ground hamburger meat, there's a chance it may be contaminated with E. coli. But we also know if you cook that to 155, that you can kill that E. coli. So if you're in a restaurant and you're looking at what the hazard is in that hamburger, well, it would be the E. coli, which is a biological hazard. What would be your control for that? Cooking is your control for that. So then you have to set a critical limit for that control, and that critical limit would be the 155. And then you would want to set up some type of monitoring that you know that it reaches 155. Well, how would you do that? Well, you take regular temperatures of the finished product to make sure that your grill's hot enough and is getting it to that you've left it on there long enough. So that, you know, that's a simplified version of HACCP, you know, in a fast food place, for instance.
What are the most common causes of foodborne illness associated with food service?
We kind of touched on that a little bit. When I talked about the risk factors, those are some of the most common causes. Employee health and proper hygiene is really leading the way, especially with viruses, noroviruses in particular. Norovirus is what you hear about on the cruise ships when everybody gets sick. That's a norovirus. That's passed from person. That's a people thing. That's where it comes from. So there's been some recent estimates that suggest that up to 60% of the foodborne outbreaks associated with the restaurants could be traced back to a sick worker or poor hygiene. So that's probably our leading #1 cause right now. And so hand washing, you hear about wearing gloves. We don't actually have a glove rule. We do have a bare hand prohibition against handling ready-to-eat foods. So gloves can be used to comply with that rule. Hand washing and employee health policies, where the managers are noticing whether you've got an employee who's missing on the line because they can't stay out of the bathroom. Well, they probably need to go home that day.
Mm-hmm. Is there any mandatory testing of employees, like looking for Shigella or something like that?
There's not any mandatory testing.
You mentioned earlier the food code. What is the food code?
Well, the food code is typically, that's just a term used for any set of regulations to regulate restaurants. But the food code is actually, there's a model food code that the Food and Drug Administration publishes on a regular basis. And it's just a model set of provisions that address the safety and protection of food that is prepared at food service establishments and served to the consumer. It's the current best knowledge based on science that we know how to do those things. So the FDA, or Food and Drug Administration, publishes that every 4 years. I have a copy. This is the 2009 version, actually. In Alabama, the State Board of Health has adopted the 2005 version. There has been a 2013 come out, and we'll be looking at adopting that in Alabama the next coming year.
Will that cause major changes to a lot of restaurants?
Well, there's not any major changes. There are some changes, and we work very closely with our trade associations and our external partners. So what we do is part of the process of that is to sit down with them and go over what the changes would be and what kind of hardship that would place on restaurants in Alabama, and work on ways. One example, that when we first went to the 05 food code, cold holding temperatures, there was some new science that said that we're at 45 degrees for cold holding. So your products in the refrigerator that could spoil needed to be held at 45. And we knew that would inhibit the growth of certain bacteria, specifically Listeria. So there was some new science that said, you know, Listeria can really grow at that refrigeration temperature a little more rapidly than folks thought. We need to go to 41 on that. So the model food code did come out with 41 degrees. And that was quite a hardship for a lot of places, because we're talking new equipment that can maintain that. So we worked with our industry, and we phased that in over a 5-year time period. And so we're currently at 41 in Alabama.
Can you talk to me a little bit about imported food? a lot of our food, surprisingly, is imported from other countries. The students have been introduced to the COOL laws, the country of origin labeling. Can you speak to, if you can, how much food is actually held to the U.S. standard that comes into our borders?
Well, the Food and Drug Administration is responsible for inspecting, I don't know if inspect's the correct term because I can't inspect all of it, but they're responsible for imported food. It's considered interstate commerce, so the FDA has the statutory jurisdiction over that. Food that is imported into the United States is supposed to meet the same requirements from domestic suppliers. So if you have a food manufacturing plant in another country, it should meet the same requirements as the food manufacturing plant in the United States. FDA estimates that about 15% of our food supply is imported. Now that will go up depending on categories. If you take just seafood, for example, it's estimated that maybe 80% of our seafood is imported. But if you across all categories, about 15%. Now they, in actuality, can only look at about 2% of that as it comes in. So, and they do that at ports of entry. And Alabama actually has 3 ports of entry. I think everybody would say, well, Mobile is our only port in Alabama. Well, you got to look at airports too. So Birmingham and Huntsville are also considered ports of entry by the FDA, and they have staff stationed there that would inspect that food. Now, what helps FDA a little bit with that is they have you have to let them know ahead of time before you ship something here. So they have to know you're going to ship it. And then they have some computer systems and models where they can look at to see if you've been cited before for problems, or if other countries have not let that product in and you're trying to get it into the United States. So they can look at that, and then they look at a certain percentage as it comes in. If you don't let them know you're going to ship, they don't have to let that product in. They also send inspectors overseas to other countries to inspect the plants. So there is some of that that's going on. They've recently in the last few years since the passage of the Food Safety Modernization Act, have actually have residence posts in China, Costa Rica, a couple other countries, I think, where they actually have inspectors on site working with that country's regulatory infrastructure.
Can you talk a little bit about how we protect our food from infection by prions? Because as I understand it, there's nothing that can disable the activity of prions once they've been ingested and that they cross species barriers. That's kind of frightening. I know that in the past we had some sheep farmers in the United States, and they felt there was evidence of prion infection, and they actually had to take out the entire herd. So is that something that concerns your office?
Well, the health department doesn't work with that directly. Again, we work with one of our partners, typically Department of Agriculture, that looks at that. And with the BSE, or the, I can't say the bovine.
Spongiform encephalopathy, yeah.
That's typically with, the neural tissue. So there were some bans in place. Cows had to be a certain age, that sort of thing. And Ag also does a lot of work with the feed mills to make sure that we're not getting contaminated feed. And just as a note, when we talk about food with the Food and Drug Administration, and more so with state and local jurisdictions that have some involvement in that, food includes animal feed. So anything animal feed that's going to go into a product or an animal that eventually is going to be for human consumption is considered food and is treated pretty strict. Okay.
Well, Mark, is there anything else you want to tell our students today?
Well, there is one thing. When I was talking about the food code, the question that come to my mind, well, how does stuff get into the food code? We've got this FDA just make this stuff up and put it in there. Well, there's actually an interesting process of how the food code gets updated, and it's called the Conference for Food Protection. And that conference meets every 2 years, and it's made up of industry, academia, and regulators. And if you have an issue, suppose you're a researcher, and you find, and I mentioned the 45 to 41, well, that was an issue at the Conference for Food Protection. So we really need to look at this. The scientific evidence is showing us that Listeria grows at colder temperatures. So that got debated at that conference, and there's The conference is divided into 3 councils that looks at different categories of issues for inclusion into the food code. And the conference is held every 2 years over a week period, and those issues are debated in the councils. And then they're put forth to what they call an assembly of delegates, which is all regulators. And the council makes recommendations. So we've looked at the science behind this. It looks valid. We've heard the testimony. We think this is a change that needs to be made in the food code. And then the assembly delegates will vote on it. So it's a very democratic process on how this gets done, but it's based on science. And then those recommendations are sent from the conference to both CDC, USDA, and FDA for inclusion in the various, not just the food code, but could be some other regulations as well. So the FDA just doesn't sit somewhere in a large building in DC and make this stuff up. It's actually a contribution by all the interested parties, industry, academia, and regulators.
Yeah, one last question that just occurred to me. Do you think most foodborne illness happens as a result of individuals handling their food improperly, or more on the retail, wholesale side?
Well, certainly, and there's been, certainly there's room at home for that, but it's a limited, generally if you're going to take food home and mishandle it, you're only going to make your immediate family sick. If you're an establishment that's serving hundreds of people a day, then that potential, as you can, so the foodborne outbreaks or illness outbreaks that we work with are through the establishment. So the large ones are going to come through establishments. And we've had a lot more multi-state outbreaks, and those are associated possibly with manufactured foods and even produce. You think about the outbreak associated with cantaloupe. Mm-hmm. And there was criminal charges filed in that because of some problems that were found on the farm and at the packing plant by the farmers themselves.
Okay, well, I'm glad you guys are there and that we have these agencies. And I really appreciate you speaking to our class today. Thank you so much.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.